Hello photographers, this is Boris from Excitement for the Eyes. Most photographers have more than one camera, a primary camera, backup camera, different cameras for different purposes, A-roll camera, B-roll camera. If these cameras feature significant differences in user interface, it can be detrimental for intuitive use and quick change of settings. In my personal case, for wildlife photography and filming, I'm using a Canon EOS R and a Canon EOS R5. And in fact, their user interfaces have some significant differences. If you want to know how I set up my cameras in a consistent way in order to be efficient on the one hand, but also still benefit from the specific strengths of each of the cameras, stay tuned. Okay, we'll go in 3 steps. First, why do we use the Canon EOS R and the Canon EOS R5 cameras? Second, what are the differences in the user interface? And last but not least, third, how do I configure these cameras for the purpose of a consistent intuitive user interface, which enables fast changes of settings in the field in the context of wildlife filming and photography. If you want to jump directly to one of the sections, please see the timestamps in the description below. First step. Why do I use the Canon EOS R5 and Canon EOS R cameras? The EOS R5 features for photos up to 20 frames per second, which is great for fast moving objects like flying birds. It has a great eye and animal detect autofocus. It has 45 megapixels, which is nice for cropping. And it has in-body image stabilization. Concerning video, in 4K, I have full frame without crop. And my favorite feature is in fact the slow motion capability in 4K up to 100 or respectively 120 frames per second, which is really great for birds in flight. Why not the EOS R6, which is much cheaper? In case of birds in flight, fast moving objects, it might be really difficult to frame correctly the object, and it's nice to have a cropping capability. With the only approximately 20 megapixel resolution of the EOS R6 in comparison to the R5 with 45 megapixels, the cropping possibilities are much limited. So for me, that's a really strong point. On the opposite, of course, the low light ISO capabilities of the R6 are better than the R5. Personally, I've taken birds in flight in rather bad light conditions up to ISO 8000 with surprisingly good results on the EOS R5. Since this is difficult to show and demonstrate in a video, please feel free to visit my Flickr site that I link in the description below. Last but not least, I really love the 4x slow motion capabilities of the R5 in 4K, which are not available on the R6. Why not the EOS R3? First of all, the R3 is more expensive. Second, the lower resolution of only approximately 24 megapixels limits the cropping capabilities like on the EOS R6. Last but not least, I am personally not so sure about the quantitative benefit of 30 frames per second in comparison to 20 frames per second, taking into account the already mentioned cropping capabilities. So I prefer to be able to crop instead of having more images. So why the EOS R as a second camera? Well, first of all, we should not forget that it features the same image sensor with approximately 30 megapixels as the former 5D Mark IV, which has been one of the top cameras of Canon for quite some time. So for me personally, the Canon EOS R is just something like a cheap mirrorless version of the 5D Mark IV. Of course, the Canon EOS R sounds really slow in comparison to the R5, with its only 3 to 5 shots per second in servo AF with face and eye detection, with its approximately 5 shots per second in electronic shutter mode and only 8 shots in high-speed continuous shooting with mechanical shutter. But let's be honest, for static landscapes and for slow-moving animal situations, this is still enough. What is not relevant in the context of wildlife photography, but I still want to mention, in my opinion, the human face and eye detect of the latest firmware versions of the Canon EOS R are really working very well. So what are the main disadvantages of the EOS R? So I think while the video quality in 4K is quite good, disadvantage is that it lacks in-body stabilization and it's a cropped 4K video. Step 2. What are the main differences of the user interface between Canon EOS R and Canon EOS R5? So first of all, the Canon EOS R features the rather unconventional so-called touch bar or multi-function bar, which has caused a lot of controversy when the EOS R was originally introduced. In fact, the EOS R is the only camera in a Canon lineup which features this kind of user interface. On the contrast, the R5 just has a conventional additional quick control dial on the back of the camera. Furthermore, the EOS R5 features a dedicated depth of field preview button that is not available on the Canon EOS R. And last but not least, the R5 has a dedicated zoom button, which is not available on the R either. Step 3. How do I configure my Canon EOS R5 and Canon EOS R cameras? Well, first I configure the Canon EOS R5 with a battery grip in order to have more power available for long lenses like the RF 100 to 500 millimeters or the RF 600 millimeter f4. On the contrary, I use the Canon EOS R without battery grip in order to have a lightweight compact camera, for example when hiking in the mountains, because I don't want to always carry these heavy bulky R5. When using my old Canon EF compatible lenses, I always have a control ring adapter attached. Concerning button configuration, I always use back button focus. So on the EOS R5, obviously eye and animal detect is the primary mode of autofocus operation. On a Canon EOS R, there's only the classical modes. And on the EOS R5, if the animal eye detect doesn't work properly, I have the exposure lock button as a backup button to activate classical autofocus modes as a backup. Switching between the animal eye detect and the classical AF modes is very efficient just by moving the thumb from left to right. How I configure the back button focus, I will show you via the menus. First, we want on all cameras to deactivate autofocus on the shutter button. So we go to Customize Buttons, we go to the shutter button half press, and what we want is, we want metering start. We don't want metering and autofocus start, we only want metering start. Second, on the EOS R, we want to activate the back button focus. We go to Customize Buttons, we scroll down to the AF on button, and then we want to activate metering and AF start for the AF on button. On the EOS R5, we want to activate the animal eye detect autofocus as the basic way of operation for the back button focus. So, Customize Buttons, we go down to the AF on button, And then for the AF on button, we select the eye detection autofocus. On the EOS R5, we want to activate the classical autofocus methods on the auto exposure lock button, the star button. So let's go to customize buttons, scroll down to the star button, that means the auto exposure lock button, and we select metering and AF start. How do I select the classical autofocus modes? On a Canon EOS R, I use the touch bar. I've been using this since the beginning. I'm very happy with it. So just swiping left, right on the touch bar selects the corresponding AF mode or the corresponding autofocus point. So you see here, I select the autofocus method and autofocus point, including the human face and eye detect function. On the EOS R, we want on the multifunction bar the selection of the autofocus method or autofocus point. So customize multifunction bar, select, we go to the swiping function and we select set autofocus method. The other two functions, the left tab and the right tab, are off because I don't use them. On the R5, in order to have something like a similar ergonomics, I use the quick control dial on the back of the camera for the same purpose. I will just show you how I configure this via the menus. On the EOS R5, we want to configure the selection of the autofocus method by the quick control dial on the back of the camera. So customize dials. Let's scroll to the quick control dial on the back of the camera and we select autofocus method for this dial. How do I do the depth of field review? So obviously on the R5 I use the dedicated depth of field preview button that is foreseen for that purpose. On the Canon EOS R I use the star button, that means the exposure lock button, for this purpose. On the EOS R we want to activate the depth of field preview on the star button, the auto exposure lock button. So we go to customize buttons. We scroll down to the star button. The star button is the auto exposure lock button. And we select depth of field preview. On the R5 we have the dedicated zoom button. On the R it doesn't exist, so I show you how I configure a zoom function for the Canon EOS R. On the EOS R we want, on the autofocus point button, we want the Magnify glass function. So customize buttons. We scroll down to the autofocus point button and we select the Magnify reduce function. As a summary, I've shown you my consistent configuration of the user interfaces of the Canon EOS R and the Canon EOS R5 for wildlife photo and video. I always use back button focus. Obviously on the R5 animal eye detect is my primary mode of working, but I configure the classical AF mode and classical AF point selection on the R5 as a backup mode. I do the selection of the classical AF mode on the Canon EOS R with a touch bar, on the Canon EOS R5 with a quick control dial on the back of the camera, which is somehow ergonomically consistent between the two cameras. Of course, I would like to know what is your experience in the field and how you configure your cameras. Please let me know in the comments below. So thanks everybody for watching and see you next time.